I still remember the sound of the church organ that morning, heavy, slow, and somehow colder than usual. Charles had been gone for only 3 days, and I could still smell his aftershave on the black jacket hanging by the door. Savannah was quiet, almost too polite in its grief. People from the neighbourhood came to the service out of respect. My daughter Vanessa came out of obligation. I chose to wear the same black dress I'd worn to Charles's retirement dinner 15 years earlier. It was simple, elegant, and still fit me perfectly. Something that seemed to annoy Vanessa from the moment she saw me. She arrived with her husband Blake, both dressed like they were walking into a gala, not a funeral. The look on her face said it all. She thought she was the star today. While the pastor spoke about Charles's life, his dedication, his kindness, his brilliance, I felt Vanessa's gaze burning through me. I didn't turn to look. I knew that look, the one that said, "You're embarrassing me again, Mom." I'd seen it since she was 16. When it was time for family members to share their thoughts, Vanessa stood up first. She walked to the pulpit, her heels clacking against the marble floor. She gave a performance, tears that didn't reach her eyes, words that didn't belong to her heart. "My father was a man of dignity," she said. "He taught me that appearance is a reflection of respect." And then right there, with the microphone still in her hand and the church holding its breath, she turned to me and added, with that perfect mix of pity and poison, "Even when times are hard, we should still try to present ourselves properly. Some people forget that." A few gasps filled the room. One woman even reached for my arm as if to comfort me. But I didn't need it. I kept my eyes on the cross above the altar, breathing in, breathing out. Vanessa smiled, that polished, smug kind of smile that said she thought she'd just earned the final word. I let her have it. I wasn't there to argue with a woman who had confused cruelty for confidence. When the service ended, people came to shake my hand, whispering their condolences. Vanessa floated around like the host of a charity event, introducing herself to Charles's old co-workers, as if she were the new head of the family. I watched her from the side, silent, while Blake bragged about his investment firm to anyone who'd listen. Outside the church, the sun hit hard. I stood by Charles's casket as it was lowered into the ground, feeling the familiar ache of letting go, not just of a husband, but of the only person who'd ever seen all of me. Vanessa came up beside me, leaned in and whispered, just loud enough for others to hear, "Next time, Mom, maybe try something that doesn't look like it came from goodwill." A few people froze. Blake coughed to cover it up. Vanessa smirked, clearly proud of herself. I turned my head slowly, met her eyes and said quietly, "It's all right, dear. The day isn't over yet." She blinked, confused, like she couldn't decide if I was senile or sarcastic. Maybe both. Either way, I didn't care. I'd learned a long time ago that silence is the sharpest blade in the room. As the crowd began to drift toward their cars, I noticed a few sideways glances, sympathy mixed with curiosity. I'd been underestimated plenty of times before, usually by men in boardrooms. Today, by my own daughter. I reached for the brooch on my dress, a small gold pin shaped like an aeroplane wing. Charles had given it to me on our 10th anniversary, long before Vanessa learned to judge everything by price tags. He'd said, "You don't need to shine to be golden, Helen. Let the quiet ones wonder." I smiled. For the first time that day, the smile was real. As the last car pulled away, I stood alone by the grave, the Savannah wind tugging lightly at my hair. The funeral staff were folding chairs, the sound of metal scraping the ground. One of them, a young man, maybe 20, looked at me and said softly, "You holding up okay, ma'am?" I nodded. Better than most people think. When I finally walked back to my car, I saw Vanessa and Blake laughing together near the parking lot. Vanessa pointed at me, shaking her head, and said something that made him grin. That was when I realized something. I wasn't just dealing with a spoiled child anymore. I was dealing with someone who'd forgotten where she came from, or worse, who she came from. And that, I thought, was about to change. If you've ever had someone in your own family look down on you, tell me about it in the comments. I read every story, and you'd be surprised how many of us have lived through that kind of disrespect. And if you like stories where karma doesn't knock, it walks right in, make sure you subscribe. We have plenty more truth to share. Vanessa and Blake's laughter echoed faintly behind me as I started the car. The gold brooch glinted in the sunlight, and I could almost hear Charles whisper in my ear again, "You don't need to shine be golden." So I didn't, not yet. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of rain against the window. It wasn't the soft kind. It was sharp, insistent, like the sky was tired of holding it in. My house felt too big without Charles in it. The silence was heavier than the storm. The smell of coffee still came from the old percolator because I'd set the timer the night before, a habit Charles never let me break. I stood in the kitchen wearing his old flannel robe. It still had a faint smell of motor oil and cedar soap. He used to tease me about stealing it, saying I made it look better than he ever did. I poured my coffee and let the warmth settle in my hands. That was when I noticed the folded piece of paper on the counter, the one Vanessa had left there after the funeral. A list of next steps, she'd called it. Funeral bills, estate matters, and written in her perfectly neat handwriting, "Mom, you need to think about your long-term care." That line hit harder than the rain. Long-term care. As if I were some old appliance she was planning to trade in before it broke down. I crumpled the paper and tossed it in the trash. The truth was, I'd built a quiet life for a reason. Charles and I had agreed years ago to keep our real work out of sight. He'd been the face of Whitaker Aerotech, the charming engineer who gave speeches, met with investors, shook hands for the cameras. But the real designs, the patents, the contracts, those had my signature, my mind, my calculations. Back in the 1980s, a woman being the brains behind an aerospace company was an inconvenience, so we'd played the roles they expected. He was the genius, I was the supportive wife. The only people who ever knew the truth were the lawyers, and every one of them was bound by contract and loyalty. Vanessa, of course, never had the patience to learn any of that. She thought the company was something her father had built alone, something that should have been passed to her like a family heirloom. What she didn't realize was that after Charles retired, I'd restructured everything. My name had gone back on the ownership papers, quietly, legally, completely. I took another sip of coffee, thinking about how Charles used to smile when Vanessa came around. He'd always say, "She's got your fire. Helen just needs your compass." But I knew better. Fire without direction burns everything in its path. The doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened the door, Blake stood there holding an umbrella and a box of muffins. His smile was rehearsed, that kind of professional politeness lawyers use before they slide a document across the table. "Morning, Mrs. Whitaker," he said, like we hadn't buried my husband yesterday. "Vanessa thought I should check in on you, make sure you're okay." I stepped aside and let him in. He shook off the rain and handed me the box. "Blueberry," he said. "Your favourite, right?" "Charles's favourite," I corrected. He gave a sympathetic nod, the kind that usually comes before bad news. "Listen, Helen," he began, "I know you've got a lot on your plate. Funerals, estates, financial paperwork. It can be overwhelming. Vanessa and I were talking, and we think it might be smart to simplify things." "Simplify," I repeated. "That's an interesting word for a lawyer." He laughed lightly, pretending not to hear the edge in my tone. "We just want to help, that's all. Maybe look over the estate plan, make sure everything's handled properly. Vanessa's worried about you being alone in this big house." I glanced at the window. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the reflection in the glass caught Blake's expression. Not concern, but calculation. "You're her husband," I said. "That makes this conversation personal, not professional." "Of course," he said quickly. "Family first." I smiled. "Good. Then you won't mind if I keep family matters in the family." The silence stretched long enough for the clock in the hall to click twice. Blake shifted on his feet, then gave a polite nod. "Of course. We just thought maybe you'd want help managing things. With Charles gone, I imagine the finances might get a little complicated." I didn't respond. I simply walked over to the sideboard, opened a drawer and took out a thick envelope. Inside were property documents, investment summaries, and a few pieces of paper with enough legal weight to crush whatever assumptions he was standing on. I didn't show them to him. I just placed the envelope back in the drawer, slow and deliberate. Blake noticed. His smile faltered. "I appreciate your concern," I said evenly. "But you don't need to worry about me, Blake. I've been managing complex systems longer than you've been managing a haircut." His jaw tightened. For a moment, I saw the real man behind the charm, the one who measured people by what he thought he could gain from them. "We'll talk soon," he said, forcing a smile. "Vanessa really just wants to make sure you're comfortable. Tell her I've never been more comfortable in my life." After he left, I watched through the curtain as he walked down the path, phone already in his hand. He was talking fast, probably to Vanessa. I didn't need to hear the words. I knew exactly how that conversation would go. She's old but sharp. We'll have to play it slower. I went back to the kitchen, poured the last of the coffee and set the cup beside the sink. The storm outside had cleared and the afternoon light came in softer, almost gold. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than grief. Not anger. That would have been too simple. It was focus. People like Vanessa and Blake always mistake quiet for weakness. They think silence means surrender. What they never understand is that silence is a strategy, one I'd mastered long before they learned how to fake empathy. I walked to my study, opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out the file marked contingency. Inside were signed agreements, corporate amendments, and letters from lawyers I trusted more than family. Charles used to say, "If something ever happens to me, make sure they know who they're dealing with." I smiled faintly, tracing his signature on the final page. "Don't worry, Charles. They'll know soon enough." The door creaked open before I could even reach for the handle. Vanessa never knocked. She just let herself in, heels tapping across the hardwood floor like she owned the place. I was sitting at the dining table, sorting through sympathy cards, though most of them were just empty gestures, signatures without sincerity. "Mom," she said, too brightly, "I told Blake we shouldn't surprise you, but I just couldn't wait another day." I looked up from the stack of envelopes. "Surprises don't usually come with real estate folders," I said, nodding toward the manila folder in her hand. She laughed, a high-pitched sound that didn't belong in a house still full of mourning. "Always so observant," she said, setting it down. "I was just thinking it's time we talk about plans." I didn't answer. She took that as permission to keep talking. "Blake and I met with an estate advisor," she continued. "We just want to make sure everything's handled the right way. You know, probate, transfers, investments. You shouldn't have to deal with all that paperwork by yourself." I picked up my teacup and let the silence stretch. People like Vanessa couldn't stand silence. It forced them to reveal themselves. "You and Dad built a life together," she went on. "It's only right that your family helps manage what's left." "What's left?" I repeated softly. "That's one way to put it." Vanessa smiled like she was trying to soothe a difficult client. "Don't take it that way, Mom. I just want to protect you. This house is too big and the upkeep must be exhausting. Blake thinks selling it would take a huge weight off your shoulders. You could move into something smaller, maybe even a senior community," I finished for her. Her smile froze. "Well, yes, somewhere safe with people your own age." I set down my teacup. "People my own age?" She fidgeted with her necklace, the gold one I'd given her on her wedding day, back when I thought she still knew what gratitude meant. "You know what I mean. It's just you've been through a lot. I want to make sure you're taken care of." "By you," I said. "And Blake." "Of course. Who else would I trust?" Her tone was almost convincing. Almost. I stood and walked to the window. The magnolia tree in the front yard was blooming, white petals falling across the driveway like snow. Charles had planted that tree the year Vanessa was born. He used to say it was a symbol, strong roots, steady growth, beauty that didn't beg for attention. "Vanessa," I said, keeping my voice calm, "do you know how your father and I bought this house?" She looked confused by the question. "Through the company, right? Whittaker Aerotech?" "Yes, but not with his salary." She tilted her head. "Then how? With mine." She laughed, thinking I was joking. When she saw that I wasn't smiling, the sound died in her throat. "Yours? But you weren't. I mean, Dad was the face," I interrupted. "He was the public name. I was the contracts, the patents, the financial backbone, every major design, every negotiation, every acquisition, my signature's on them all." Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. "Mom, why are you telling me this now?" "Because you came here with a plan to take control of something you don't understand," I said quietly, "and I think it's time you learned what you're really standing on." The silence that followed was thick, but not the grieving kind. It was the silence of recalculation, the sound of Vanessa's mind rewriting her version of the world. Blake chose that moment to step into the doorway. He must have been waiting in the car, pretending to check emails. His timing was never accidental. "There you are," he said smoothly. "We were just discussing some ideas." "I was," I said quickly. "Mom and I were having a nice chat about the future." "Good," Blake said, "because I've been drafting something that might help speed things along." He pulled out a folder from his briefcase. My lawyer's instincts, the ones I'd buried for years, recognized the thickness of a preliminary contract. "This is just a simple authorization," he said, sliding it toward me. "It would let us help manage your estate, pay bills, handle accounts, that sort of thing. We'll make sure everything's in order." I didn't touch it. "You mean power of attorney?" He blinked. "In essence, yes, but purely for convenience." I looked at Vanessa. "Do you know what this means?" She hesitated, her confidence flickering. "Blake said it's just a way to help you. It's temporary." "Temporary," I repeated, "until the assets transfer." Blake straightened his tie. "Mrs. Whitaker, I assure you—" "Save it," I said. "You're not the first man who's tried to out-talk me with legalese. I wrote my first contract before you learned how to drive." His jaw tightened. Vanessa's eyes darted between us, confusion turning to embarrassment. "Mom, please," she said softly. "You're overreacting." "No," I said, walking back to the table. "I'm remembering." I picked up a pen and twirled it in my fingers. "You think this house, this company, this name are yours to manage, but everything you see around you exists because your father and I worked for decades while you were busy judging the way I dressed." Vanessa's face reddened. "That's not fair. Neither is manipulation disguised as love." Blake cleared his throat. "We should go." "Yes," I said. "You should." He gathered his papers quickly, his jaw set tight. Vanessa lingered, torn between pride and discomfort. "Mom," she whispered, "you make everything so difficult." I smiled faintly. "Only for people who underestimate me." When the door shut behind them, the house fell quiet again. I picked up the unsigned document they'd left behind. Across the top, in bold letters, it read, "Durable power of attorney, estate and financial affairs." I folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer beside Charles's photograph. He'd warned me years ago this day might come. The storm outside had passed, but the air still carried its electricity. I sat at the table, tracing the rim of my teacup. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, steady and calm. Somewhere deep down, under the ache of loss, something else stirred, a quiet, deliberate resolve. Vanessa thought she'd come here to manage her mother's future. She had no idea she'd just set mine in motion. The sound of thunder rolled in just as I opened the old storage trunk in my study. It was Charles's voice in my head that guided me. The same voice that used to say, "Keep your evidence where fools don't think to look." Inside the trunk were files no one had seen in decades. Contracts, patent records, and original partnership agreements for Whitaker Aerotech, all signed by me. The paper smelled like old ink and rain. It was proof. Solid, legal, undeniable proof that everything Vanessa thought belonged to her father's estate was mine long before she learned how to spell inheritance. I'd kept my maiden name on all the early documents. Back in the 1980s, it was the only way to make investors take me seriously. The world wasn't ready to believe a woman could design flight control systems for military contracts or negotiate government deals worth millions. So while Charles became the face of innovation, I became the signature that made it real. When he retired, we restructured everything quietly. I made sure of that. Every major share, every piece of intellectual property, every asset transfer, all documented, sealed, notarized. Charles had insisted it was unnecessary. "You're my wife," he'd said. "You don't need a lawyer between us." And yet he'd smiled when I did it anyway. He knew how the world worked, especially when family got involved. The doorbell rang again, softer this time. I half expected Vanessa to have returned for round two, but when I looked through the window, I saw a face I hadn't seen in years, Eleanor Grant. She stood there, raincoat soaked, umbrella in one hand, leather portfolio in the other. "Still keeping your lawyer hours, Helen," she said when I opened the door. "Some habits don't fade," I replied, smiling for the first time that week. "Come in before you catch pneumonia." Eleanor and I had gone to law school together. She'd taken the public route, Politics, advocacy, the occasional scandal on cable news. I'd gone private, discreet, effective. Over the years, she'd become my unofficial guardian angel in matters too delicate for public record. She hung her coat, then studied my face for a moment. "Vanessa came to see me this morning," she said. "Of course she did," I sighed. She always liked skipping to the part where she gets her way. Eleanor opened her portfolio and pulled out a copy of the power of attorney draft. "She asked me to look this over for you, said it was a routine family arrangement. I told her I'd get back to her after I spoke with you." I couldn't help but smile. "And what did you think of it?" "It's not routine," Eleanor said flatly. "It's a full transfer of authority. Once signed, you'd lose control of everything. Assets, accounts, property, all under the pretense of assistance. And the fact that Blake's name appears anywhere on this tells me he's the architect." She paused. "How much do they know?" "Nothing," I said. "Not who I really am, not what I still own. They think I'm just the widow of an engineer with a house and a pension." Eleanor exhaled slowly. "Then they've made a fatal mistake." She spread out her documents across my dining table, her way of drawing a battlefield map. "Here's what we'll do," she said, slipping into professional mode. "First, we'll secure every asset under your personal trust. I'll update the firm registry to reflect your controlling interest in Whitaker Aerotech. Then we'll make sure any attempt to act on your behalf triggers an automatic legal review." "You're saying I should prepare for a fight," I said. "I'm saying they've already started one." The grandfather clock in the hall chimed softly as we worked through the paperwork. Each signature I added was another nail in the coffin of their little plan. It wasn't vengeance. Not yet. It was defense. When Eleanor finally packed up her files, she looked at me thoughtfully. "Helen, I've known you for 40 years. You're not a woman who reacts without cause. What's your plan once they realize who they're dealing with?" I smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't need explaining. "Let them find out the hard way." She laughed under her breath. "Still the same Helen Whitaker I met at Columbia. I pity anyone who thinks they can outsmart you." After she left, I sat back down at the table. The rain had stopped, but the wind carried a chill that slipped through the cracks of the old windows. The power of attorney draft still sat there, the edges slightly damp from Eleanor's umbrella. I picked it up and read the first line again. "This document grants full financial and legal authority to the undersigned parties." I tore it cleanly down the middle. The sound was sharp, satisfying. When I threw the pieces into the fireplace, the flames took them greedily. For the first time since Charles's death, I felt lighter. Not peaceful, not yet, but awake. From the hallway, I could see the framed photo of Vanessa on the mantel. She was 10, wearing a crooked smile and holding the model airplane Charles had built with her for the science fair. She'd been so proud of that project. I'd done most of the wiring. She'd taken all the credit. Even then, the signs were there, the hunger to be admired without earning it. The phone rang, breaking the moment. I answered. "Mom?" Vanessa's voice was sugary sweet. "I just wanted to check in. Blake felt bad about earlier." I'm sure he did," I said evenly. "Well, we've been talking, and we think it would be good to meet tomorrow. You know, just to go over a few things before Blake heads back to Atlanta." "Tomorrow works," I said. "Oh, good, I'll bring lunch. Maybe we can all just clear the air." I almost laughed at that. Vanessa never did anything to clear the air. She did it to control it. "See you then," I said, and hung up. I turned back toward the fire. The papers had turned to ash, the faint smell of burned ink lingering in the air. I watched it swirl upward, dancing in the light. It was strange, the way grief and clarity could coexist in the same heartbeat. Charles was gone, but his warnings echoed louder than ever. People reveal their true nature when they think they're in control, and Vanessa was about to show me exactly who she really was. The smell of roasted chicken hit me before the doorbell did. Vanessa never cooked, which meant this was part of her performance. I opened the door to find her holding a takeout bag from some trendy downtown bistro, smiling like a politician's wife. "Lunch delivery from your favourite daughter," she said, brushing past me before I could answer. "Good," I said, locking the door behind her. "I was afraid the food might come without the lecture." She laughed in that light, false way that used to charm her teachers. Blake followed, balancing 2 bottles of wine. Thought we'd make it a proper meal, he said. You do know it's noon, right? I asked, but they were already setting the table, chatting like this was a family reunion instead of an ambush. We ate in the dining room where Charles and I used to host Christmas dinners. The light from the window hit his empty chair like a spotlight. Vanessa filled the silence with stories about real estate, her friends' new cars, and some influencer she'd met at a charity event. Blake nodded at all the right moments. Then, halfway through dessert, the real reason for their visit finally crawled out from behind the smiles. Mom, Vanessa began, dabbing her mouth with a napkin. I know we've had a few tense moments, but Blake and I really want what's best for you. You've been through a lot, and the stress of managing everything alone isn't healthy. I raised an eyebrow. Managing everything alone? You mean surviving without adult supervision? She ignored the jab. We just think you'd be happier with less to worry about. A smaller place, less responsibility, fewer bills. Blake leaned in, finishing for her. And with your permission, we could help coordinate it all. Make sure your finances stay protected. I sipped my tea. You mean make sure your inheritance stays protected? Vanessa's eyes flickered, but she forced a laugh. Oh, come on, Mom. You make it sound so cold. Reality usually is. Blake cleared his throat. We're talking about security. Your peace of mind, not money, I smiled politely. Security, that's a nice word for control. They exchanged a look, the kind couples give when they think they're still on the same side. Blake took a deep breath, ready to push harder. Helen, I work in corporate law. I've seen too many cases where people lose everything because they didn't have proper management. You wouldn't believe how fast accounts can be frozen, properties contested. I set down my cup. I'd believe it, I said, because I wrote half of those contracts. He blinked. I'm sorry? Whittaker Aerotech's legal framework, the one your firm loves to reference in its lectures. I drafted it, back when you were probably still learning to spell jurisdiction. The silence was delicious. Vanessa looked like she wanted to melt into her chair. Blake's jaw twitched. You're saying you. I'm saying, I interrupted, that I understand the law, and I understand manipulation disguised as concern. He leaned back slowly, regaining composure. No one's trying to manipulate you. Of course not, I said, standing. You're just trying to relocate me, gain financial access, and assume legal authority. Out of love. Vanessa shot up from her chair. Mom, that's unfair! You're twisting everything we're trying to do for you. I turned to her, steady. And you're dressing greed up as responsibility. Don't pretend it's charity when you're just hungry for control. Her mouth opened, but Blake placed a hand on her arm. His eyes met mine, cold and clinical. Helen, this isn't personal. I laughed softly. That's the problem, Blake. You think nothing ever is. He gathered the folders from his briefcase, his tone turning professional. If you change your mind, we'll keep the paperwork ready. Just remember, some decisions can't wait forever. I've already made mine, I said. When they left, the house was quiet again. The air still smelled like roasted garlic and cheap white wine, an odd perfume for betrayal. I walked back to the dining table and stared at the empty plates, the wine stains on the linen, the crumbs on the floor. They'd come into my home pretending to help, and all I could think about was how familiar it felt. Because I'd seen this before. Years ago, when Whittaker Aerotech was still fighting for its first government contract, a partner tried to undercut us, forge signatures, alter documents, seize intellectual property. Charles had been devastated. I'd handled it myself. I'd gathered evidence, contacted the right people, and within 2 weeks that partner was disbarred, bankrupt and forgotten. Charles had called it ruthless. I called it justice. And now, decades later, my daughter and her husband were trying the same trick. Only this time, they didn't realize whose playbook they were copying. I started collecting dishes, washing them one by one. The rhythm was steady, cleansing. Outside, the sun was setting, the light cutting through the magnolia branches in streaks of gold and grey. I could almost feel Charles standing beside me, that calm strength in his voice. Never show anger, Helen. Let them believe they've won. That's when they talk too much. He was right. I dried my hands and walked to the study. The fireplace was cold now, just ashes from the papers I'd burned the night before. I opened my desk drawer, pulled out my leather-bound notebook, and began writing. Names, dates, conversations. Every time Vanessa mentioned our money, every time Blake said your estate, every word that might matter later, it wasn't revenge. Not yet. It was documentation. Quiet, precise, professional. The kind of work I used to do best. When I was done, I closed the notebook, placed it in the drawer, and turned off the light. The reflection in the window showed a tired widow in a black cardigan. But behind her eyes, something else had started moving. Slow, deliberate, unstoppable. The house might have been silent, but I could already hear the gears turning. The next morning started with the faint hum of my landline. Nobody under 40 called landlines anymore, which meant it had to be someone from my generation, someone who still understood that important things weren't discussed over text messages. "Mrs. Whittaker?" the voice asked, calm and familiar. "This is Tom Rivers. Eleanor mentioned you might call, but I figured I'd save you the trouble." Tom had been a private investigator since the Reagan years, a quiet professional who could find out what people didn't want found out. He'd worked with me and Charles back in the early days, when corporate espionage meant men in suits stealing documents, not hackers behind screens. "I didn't know Eleanor still had you on speed dial," I said. "She keeps me around for the heavy lifting," he replied. "Said you've got family trouble brewing?" "Let's call it misplaced ambition," I said, glancing toward the envelope Vanessa had left on the counter, the one with the legal forms she thought I hadn't opened. "Well, ambition leaves fingerprints," Tom said. "Tell me what you need." By the time I hung up, he was already on his way. 2 hours later, his pickup pulled into my driveway, the same dull grey Ford he'd been driving 20 years ago. He stepped out wearing a raincoat that had seen better days, holding a small notepad and a smile that said he'd seen it all before. "You look the same, Helen," he said, shaking my hand. "Mean that as a compliment." "I'll take it that way," I said. "Come in before the neighbourhood watch calls the police on a suspicious vehicle." We sat in the kitchen with coffee and lemon cake, the same way we used to back when we were chasing down missing contracts. Tom flipped open his notepad, his handwriting neat, methodical, like someone trained to record truth without emotion. "So your son-in-law and daughter are trying to move in on your assets," he said. "That about right?" I nodded. "They think I'm fragile. Maybe they believe the grief's made me weak. They want to get my signature on a power of attorney and take it from there." "Classic elder exploitation," he said, shaking his head. "Happens more than people think. Usually it's strangers, but family's messier." "They're not strangers," I said. "They just stopped seeing me clearly." He leaned back in his chair. "What do you want to happen, Helen? You want protection or you want exposure?" "Both," I said. "I want them to learn the difference between concern and control, and I want them to do it the hard way." Tom smiled slightly. "That sounds like the Helen I remember. I walked him through everything, the visits, the contracts, the polite manipulation. He took notes without interrupting, occasionally nodding when something lined up with what he'd already suspected. When I was done, he closed the notebook and said, "All right, here's what I'll do. First, I'll run background checks on Blake, finances, business dealings, credit history, side projects. I'll also get a sense of whether he's been talking to anyone else about your estate. You'd be surprised how fast these things spread once people smell money." "I wouldn't be," I said. "That smell follows greed like perfume." He chuckled. "Then I'll check property records, see if they've already been moving assets around, or if they've filed any preliminary claims in case you, well, pass unexpectedly." "That's cheerful," I said dryly. "Necessary," he replied. "You'd be shocked how often it happens." He stood, put on his coat, and looked at me seriously. "You want me to dig into your daughter too?" I paused. That question hurt more than I wanted to admit. "Only if you have to," I said quietly. "She's lost, not evil. But if she's complicit, then yes." Tom gave a single nod. "Understood." After he left, I found myself sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at the magnolia tree again. Its blossoms had started to fall early this year, white petals scattering across the grass like quiet reminders that beauty doesn't last unless you protect it. Around 4 o'clock, Eleanor called. "Tom just checked in," she said. "He's already found something interesting. You might want to sit down." "I'm already sitting," I said. "Blake's firm, Holloway and Pierce, is under investigation by the State Bar, misappropriation of client funds. Nothing public yet, but it's bad. I let out a slow breath. So that's why he's been so eager to manage my finances. Probably hoping to shift attention or liquidate assets through you, she said. If he gets you to sign anything, it gives him a paper trail to exploit. Then we make sure he doesn't, I said. Eleanor's tone softened. You sure you're ready to go through this again, Helen? I know how you get when someone challenges your integrity. I'm not angry, I said. I'm prepared. She laughed softly. That's what worries me. After the call, I poured another cup of coffee and opened the file drawer again. Inside were decades of records, contracts, patents, letters, everything Charles and I had built. I pulled out the most important document, the partnership dissolution agreement from 2012, when Charles stepped down and transferred everything back to me. It had been notarized by Eleanor herself. I read through the lines slowly, tracing the signatures, the stamps, the careful legal language that defined ownership not by love or assumption, but by fact. My name, Helen Whitaker, written in clean black ink beside the title Founder and Executive Partner. That was who I still was. The woman everyone had forgotten about because I'd chosen to be invisible. A soft vibration on the counter broke the silence. A text message from Vanessa. Mom, hope you're feeling better. Blake says we should all meet again soon. Maybe next week? I stared at the screen, the corners of my mouth lifting just slightly. Of course, sweetheart. Let's make it lunch. My treat this time. I hit send and set the phone down. The clock in the hallway chimed 6 times, the same rhythm Charles used to tap when he was thinking. I could almost hear him saying it again. Be patient, Helen. They'll expose themselves if you let them talk long enough. The air felt lighter after that, charged but clear. I didn't feel like a victim or even a widow anymore. I felt like what I had always been, a woman who knew how to protect and, when necessary, how to destroy what threatened her peace. The magnolia petals kept falling outside, silent and steady. Inside, I began to plan. The next few days were strangely quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't bring peace, just space to think. I spent the mornings trimming the magnolia branches and the afternoons pretending to nap while I waited for the phone to ring. It always did. Vanessa never could stand silence. On the 3rd day, it finally came. Mom, she began, her voice softer than usual, the one she used when she wanted something. Blake and I were thinking, maybe we pushed too hard the other day. Maybe, I said, setting my pruning shears down on the porch table. But then again, pushing is something you're very good at. She gave a forced laugh. We just want to help. Blake says there are still some legal documents that need attention, and I figured we could all go through them together. No pressure. Lunch again? Sure, she said quickly, relieved. I'll bring everything. You just relax, okay? Of course, I said, though relaxing wasn't what I had in mind. By the time they arrived the next day, I'd already set the table and turned on the small digital recorder tucked beneath the napkin holder. I wasn't interested in drama. I wanted evidence. Vanessa came in all smiles, arms full of containers, perfume strong enough to mask the smell of calculation. Blake followed, expression polite but eyes sharp. You look great, he said. Grief suits you. Funny, I replied. It used to suit you too. His jaw tightened just slightly. Vanessa pretended not to notice. Let's sit, she said, unpacking sandwiches like it was a picnic. Blake printed the paperwork again, but he made some changes. Just simpler stuff. Streamlining, you know. I looked down at the documents he slid toward me. The formatting was clean, the legal phrasing slick. He'd taken out the obvious power of attorney language, but replaced it with clauses buried 3 pages deep. It wasn't just an authorization, it was a silent transfer of decision-making rights in unforeseen circumstances. Blake leaned forward, tone patient. All we're doing is ensuring continuity, Mrs. Whitaker. In case something unexpected happens, your assets won't get locked up. It's the smart move. I nodded slowly. You're right, Blake. It is smart. Vanessa beamed. See? I told you Mom would understand once we explained it calmly. I smiled back. You're right too, dear. Calm makes everything clearer. They relaxed, mistaking courtesy for surrender. Blake poured wine while Vanessa talked about selling the house. Once Mom's ready, like I wasn't even there. I listened quietly, nodding at all the right moments, giving them what they needed. Comfort. That's the thing about liars. They feed on it. Halfway through the meal, I let my hand tremble just enough to make Vanessa's concern look real again. You know, I said softly, you might be right. I'm not as sharp as I used to be. Vanessa's eyes softened with the kind of pity that always carried a price. Oh, Mom, don't say that. You're still the strongest person I know. Am I? I asked, letting my voice waver, because lately I do get confused. All those papers, all those numbers. I can't tell what's what anymore. Blake took the cue immediately. That's exactly why we're here, to take that burden off you. I nodded, looking down at the pen resting on the table. Maybe I should just sign and be done with it. His eyes lit up before he caught himself. No rush, of course, he said quickly. You should read it first. Oh, I trust you, Blake, I said, steadying my hand on the paper. Your family! Vanessa leaned in, barely breathing. That's right, Mom. You can trust us. I smiled gently, then looked up at her. That's what I told your father too, the day he made me co-owner of Whittaker Aerotech. The pen froze an inch from the signature line. Blake blinked, confused. Co-owner? Yes, I said, my voice calm again. Didn't Vanessa tell you? I thought she might have mentioned that the house, the patents, the accounts, everything with the Whittaker name was transferred back to me years before your wedding. The air changed. You could feel it. The shift between confidence and fear. Blake's fingers tightened around his wine glass. Vanessa's mouth opened, but no sound came out. I set the pen down untouched. You see, when you've built something from nothing, you learn to anticipate storms. Charles and I planned for every scenario, even this one. He used to say, prepare for betrayal like you prepare for rain, so it never surprises you. Blake straightened his tie. I think we should revisit this conversation later, he said quietly. That's a good idea, I said. You'll need time to reconsider your next move. He gathered his papers, avoiding my eyes. Vanessa sat frozen, staring at me like she was seeing someone new. I wanted to feel angry, but I didn't. What I felt was confirmation, proof that I hadn't imagined their intentions. They'd walked straight into their own trap, and I hadn't even had to bait it. As they left, I followed them to the porch. The air outside was heavy with the promise of rain again. Blake muttered something about traffic. Vanessa turned back once, eyes wet, lips pressed tight. Mom, she said, voice trembling, why are you being so cold? I met her gaze, because warmth is wasted on people who only come near the fire when they want something. She looked away, shoulders stiff, and walked to the car. Blake didn't say a word. The engine started, tyres crunching over the gravel, then faded down the street. I stood there for a long moment now, feeling the humidity cling to my skin. In the window's reflection, I saw my own face, steady, composed, sharper than I'd felt in months. The woman staring back wasn't grieving anymore. She was waiting. Inside, the digital recorder's red light still blinked quietly on the table, capturing every word of their polite little conspiracy. I picked it up, clicked it off, and slid it into my desk drawer. By the time the first drops of rain hit the magnolia leaves, I'd already poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down in Charles's old chair. The house creaked softly, like it approved. The storm could come whenever it wanted. I was ready. The following Friday I called Vanessa with a calmness that would have scared anyone who knew me better. I thought about what you said, I told her. You're right, we should sit down like a family, have dinner, talk things through properly. She sounded relieved, almost giddy. Really, Mom? That's great. Blake will be thrilled. I'm sure he will, I said. Come around 7. I'll cook something special. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a moment, feeling the faint hum of the refrigerator and the quiet satisfaction of a plan finally reaching its centre. I didn't need to cook much. I'd already called Eleanor and asked her to join us. She, in turn, invited Dean Saunders, the current CEO of Whittaker Aerotech, under the pretense of a small reunion for old colleagues. I told her to bring Tom Rivers, too. You'll want a witness, Eleanor said, and Tom's always good at noticing what others miss. By the time the sun dipped below the magnolia tree, the table was set for 5. I wore a navy dress, nothing dramatic, but simple and crisp, the kind of thing that made people forget how old you were and pay attention to what you said. When Vanessa and Blake arrived, they looked like a catalogue couple, polished, coordinated, and quietly smug. Vanessa carried a bottle of wine. For you, Mom, she said, handing it over like a peace offering. How thoughtful, I said, setting it aside unopened. We'll save that for dessert. Her smile faltered slightly. I thought it was just us tonight. Oh, I invited a few old friends, I said lightly. You'll recognise them, I think. Before she could ask, Eleanor and Dean walked in through the back door, chatting easily. Dean's presence alone was enough to send a visible jolt through Blake. I saw the muscles in his jaw tighten as he tried to keep his composure. Dean Saunders, he said, extending his hand. I've followed your work for years. Dean shook it politely. And you are? Blake Dunn, Whittaker family. Dean's eyebrows lifted just slightly. Ah, the in-law. I motioned everyone to sit. The table was quiet at first, full of the usual polite conversation that fills the space before the real talking begins. Eleanor, bless her, was the one who pushed it over the edge. So, Vanessa, she said casually, your mother tells me you've been helping her manage her finances. Vanessa straightened her posture. Just a little guidance. Blake's been doing most of the work. He's brilliant with estate planning. Blake smiled modestly, the picture of professionalism. It's nothing major, just trying to ensure things run smoothly. Dean looked at me across the table. Funny, he said. I didn't realise the Whittaker family needed outside help. I was under the impression Mrs. Whittaker's holdings were still directly tied to our corporate structure. Blake blinked. Excuse me? Eleanor's tone was conversational, almost lazy. Helen's ownership never changed, 49% shares, registered under her name since 2012. I saw it then. The exact second Vanessa understood that her story of Dad built everything was collapsing right there on the linen tablecloth. Her eyes darted toward me, searching for some explanation. But I gave her nothing. Dean took a sip of wine. In fact, Helen's shareholdings are protected under a separate trust now, the same one that funds our innovation scholarships. Blake's voice tightened. I think there's been some misunderstanding. Oh, there's no misunderstanding, Eleanor said, pulling her phone from her purse. Just confirmation. She tapped the screen, and the faint sound of my own voice filled the room, the recording from our last lunch. Maybe I should just sign and be done with it. Oh, I trust you, Blake, your family. The recording played on, clear, undeniable. Vanessa's fake tenderness, Blake's reassuring tone, the words about transfers and security, every syllable coated in false concern. Blake went pale. That's illegal. You can't? Illegal? Eleanor interrupted sharply. That's rich, coming from someone under state investigation for embezzlement. You really should vet your partners better, Vanessa. The air felt heavy, electric. Vanessa's lip trembled, but she wasn't crying, not yet. Mom, she whispered, you recorded us? No, dear, I said, keeping my tone even. I protected myself. There's a difference. Dean set his glass down. I think I'll be leaving these two to their family matters, he said politely, rising. But before I go, Helen, if you ever want your name back on the public founders list, we'd be honoured to make that happen. I smiled. Thank you, Dean. That's kind. He turned to Vanessa. You should be proud of your mother. Without her, this company wouldn't exist. When the door closed behind him, the only sound left was the soft clink of a spoon on a plate. Vanessa's shoulders had collapsed inward. Blake sat rigid, eyes fixed on the table. Eleanor took another sip of wine and looked at me. Well, she said, I'd say dinner was productive. Tom chuckled from his seat near the door. You always did have a taste for timing, Helen. I stood, collecting the plates one by one. Timing, I said, and presentation. Two things that never fail. Vanessa finally spoke, her voice small. What happens now? Now, I said, turning to face her. Now we stop pretending. You wanted control, Vanessa. You wanted to take what you didn't earn, but I'll give you something better. Perspective. Blake tried to stand, but Eleanor's quiet glare froze him in place. Sit down, Mr. Dunn. We're not finished yet. He sank back into his chair, the colour drained from his face. I looked at my daughter, this woman who had once held my hand as a child, who now sat in front of me looking like a stranger caught stealing from her own reflection. Do you know what hurts the most, Vanessa? I asked quietly. It's not that you tried to take my money, it's that you thought I was too stupid to notice. She said nothing. There was nothing left to say. I gathered the last plate and set it in the sink, running the faucet. The sound of rushing water filled the silence, washing away the tension that had hung in the air all evening. Behind me, I heard Eleanor say softly, You always knew when to end a fight, Helen. Only when I've won, I replied. The water kept running, steady and clear. The night outside was still, but the balance in that house had shifted for good. Steam rose from the sink as I rinsed the last plate. Vanessa hadn't moved from her chair. The confidence that once coated her every word had melted away, leaving a quiet, pale woman tracing the rim of her glass with one trembling finger. Blake sat beside her, his composure unravelling thread by thread. Eleanor stood near the doorway, arms crossed, while Tom leaned against the counter like he was watching the end of a long trial. "You've made your point," Blake said finally. His tone was sharp but hollow, the kind of voice men use when they know they've lost but still want to sound important. I dried my hands with the linen towel, turned and looked at him. "I haven't even started." He blinked, startled. "Do you know why your firm was able to build half its contracts in this state?" I asked. "Because my husband and I wrote the legal framework that made those deals possible. You've been making a living off the policies I helped design, Blake. Every document you've ever filed sits on the foundation I built." He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Eleanor stepped forward, dropping a folder on the table. The sound echoed like a gavel. "These are the official records of Whittaker Aerotech's original incorporation," she said, "signed by both Charles and Helen Whittaker. And these," she placed another stack beside it, "are the amendments filed after Charles's retirement. Helen's full ownership. Transferred legally, publicly, permanently." Blake's eyes darted between us. "That's not possible." "It's not only possible," Eleanor interrupted. "It's been verified by Dean Saunders himself. He's already updated the company's website to include Helen's name under founders." Vanessa's head jerked up. "You did what?" Eleanor gave her a patient smile. "Your mother's achievements deserve recognition. The world has a right to know who really created one of the most profitable aerospace systems on the eastern coast." I walked to the mantel, picked up a framed photograph of Charles and me in front of the first prototype we'd ever built. I held it for a second before setting it down again. "You wanted to make me invisible, Vanessa. You thought if you took my name off the paperwork, I'd fade quietly into the background like I always did for your father's sake. But here's the thing about people who build from the ground up. They know where every beam is buried." The colour drained from her face. "I wasn't trying to erase you," she whispered. I thought everything belonged to Dad." "Everything belonged to both of us," I said softly, "until you tried to take it for yourself." Eleanor nodded toward me. "Tell them the rest, Helen." I turned to Vanessa and Blake. "A few months before Charles died, we agreed to transfer all assets, our shares, patents, properties, into a trust. Not one meant for inheritance, but one designed to fund scholarships for aerospace students. We called it the Charles Whittaker Foundation." Vanessa stared, confusion twisting into disbelief. You gave it away?" "I redirected it," I said, "to something that can't be corrupted by greed or vanity. Charles and I always said we wanted our work to help others, not feed egos. Now it will." Blake's hand gripped the back of his chair. "That's absurd," he said. "You can't just—" "I already did," I cut in. "The foundation is active, registered and funded. The house you're standing in, the stocks you were planning to manage, the accounts you wanted access to, they all belong to it now. You'll get nothing, Blake. Not even a tax write-off." Eleanor smiled faintly, satisfied. Tom whistled under his breath. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears, not the manipulative kind I'd seen before, but the raw, genuine kind that come from realizing you've finally pushed too far. "You're punishing me," she said quietly. "No," I replied. "I'm teaching you. Punishment is temporary. Lessons last." She shook her head, voice breaking. "I just wanted to feel like I was part of something. Dad always talked about the company, the success, the deals, but he never mentioned you. I thought he didn't trust you with it." "He trusted me with all of it," I said. "He just didn't think the world was ready for the truth. He wanted to protect me from people like you, people who measure worth by money and recognition instead of work and integrity." Vanessa looked down at her hands, silent. Blake muttered something about legal action, but his voice lacked conviction. Eleanor was faster. "You're welcome to try," she said coolly, "but given the fraud investigation against your firm, I'd advise against adding perjury to your resume." Tom chuckled. "That's lawyer speak for don't dig deeper, kid." I leaned forward, resting both hands on the table. "You called me pathetic at your father's funeral, Vanessa. Do you remember that?" She looked up, startled. "You mocked my black dress, said it looked cheap. I smiled faintly. That dress cost $90,000. It was custom made from the textile division of Whitaker Aerotech, the one I founded. Every stitch was paid for by my own designs. Eleanor's eyes gleamed. Tell them the best part, I nodded. Blake's firm? It handles accounts for several of my company's subsidiary clients. I've already signed the termination orders. He'll receive them Monday morning. The silence that followed was heavier than any thunder. Blake's shoulders sagged. Vanessa pressed her hands to her face as if she could block out the sound of her own undoing. I walked to the window, watching the moonlight spill across the magnolia tree. This isn't revenge, I said softly. It's restoration. The world always finds its balance. You can fight gravity for a while, but it always brings you back down. Eleanor gathered her things. Tom followed. Before they left, she put a gentle hand on my arm. You handled that beautifully, she whispered. Just the way Charles would have wanted, I said. When the door closed behind them, I turned back to the table. Vanessa and Blake were still sitting there, silent and small. I'll have coffee, I said, heading toward the kitchen. You're welcome to stay while it brews. Neither of them answered. The kettle began to whistle softly. I poured the water, the steam rising into the air, carrying the faint scent of calm that follows after every storm. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. It just settles in, steady and sure, because justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just exhales. Monday came with that crisp quiet that always follows a storm. Savannah's air smelled like wet pavement and magnolia sap, clean and sharp. I woke up before sunrise, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat by the kitchen window just as the light began to slide over the yard. It was the kind of morning Charles used to call truth weather, the kind that made it impossible to hide what's been done. By 8 a.m, the news had already broken. Eleanor called first. You might want to turn on Channel 5, she said, sounding far too calm for what I was about to see. The headline scrolled across the screen, Financial Advisor under State Investigation for Fraud and Elder Exploitation. Blake Dunn's face was plastered right beside it, looking like a man who had finally run out of angles. The anchor spoke in that practiced voice of professional pity. Local financial consultant Blake Dunn is being investigated by state authorities after allegations of financial misconduct and attempts to obtain power of attorney from a senior family member surfaced last week. I sipped my coffee. It was just the right temperature. They showed footage of his office being searched, boxes carried out by investigators. His firm's sign, Holloway & Pierce, hung crooked in the background, the name already losing its shine. There were no tears, no outrage, no statements, just Blake's silence, which said everything. By noon, my phone was flooded with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, old neighbours, colleagues, even one of Vanessa's high school friends. Saw the news, can't believe it. You were right about him, Helen. Some people dig their own graves and then call it landscaping. Eleanor texted again, told you truth always arrives early. But there was no joy in it, not yet. Around 3, a car pulled up outside. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Vanessa stepped out, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky. She didn't knock this time, just opened the door slowly, like someone unsure whether they were still welcome. Mom, she said, her voice raw. They've taken his computers, his files, everything. I nodded. They usually do that in a fraud case. Her lip trembled. They're saying I was part of it. Were you? No, she snapped, then softened. I mean, I didn't know what he was doing. He said it was all routine. He told me, he told you what you wanted to hear, I said. That's what men like Blake do, and you believed him because it was easier than seeing what he really was. She took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were swollen, her mascara smudged. They said you filed a report, that you turned him in. I looked at her carefully. No, Vanessa, I didn't file anything. I didn't have to. He exposed himself. She sank into a chair, staring at the floor. He said everything would be fine, that he'd protect us. Us? I repeated. He was protecting himself. You were just the alibi. Her shoulders trembled, the weight of it finally landing. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, but meaning doesn't erase consequence. We sat there in silence. The ticking clock on the wall filled the space between us, steady and unbothered. After a while, she spoke again, barely a whisper. What happens now? Now, I said softly, you deal with the fallout. You face what you chose to ignore, and you learn what it feels like to start over without taking from anyone else. The sound of her crying was quiet, almost polite. The same kind of quiet she used to give me after arguments when she was 16, right before she slammed her bedroom door. Only this time there was no door to slam, just the echo of guilt and the creak of the chair as she folded in on herself. The phone rang again. I reached for it without breaking eye contact. "Mrs. Whittaker?" a reporter's voice asked. "Would you like to comment on the allegations against your son-in-law?" "No, thank you," I said and hung up. Vanessa looked up. "They're going to ruin his life." "He did that on his own," I said, "and you can't fix it by protecting him. You can only make it worse." Her face twisted in pain. "I didn't think you could be this cold." I leaned back in my chair. "You mistook boundaries for cruelty. That's your problem, not mine." She stood up abruptly, pacing. "What am I supposed to do now? Where am I supposed to go?" "You have a house," I said. "A job, I assume, unless you quit that too." "I left my job," she admitted. "Blake said we wouldn't need the income once he handled the estate." I smiled faintly, not out of mockery, but because irony never fails to deliver. "Then it looks like you'll need to find something new." She stared at me, searching for sympathy. I didn't offer it. Not yet. The truth is, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger takes energy, and I'd already spent enough of that raising her, defending her, forgiving her. What I felt now was distance, the calm kind that only comes when justice starts to settle into place. When she finally left, she didn't slam the door. She just closed it gently, like she was afraid to wake something. The house exhaled with relief once she was gone. I walked to the window and watched her car pull away, the taillights blinking red against the fading light. The magnolia tree swayed slightly in the evening breeze, petals drifting down in slow motion. It reminded me of the early days after Charles's retirement. Quiet, measured, predictable. The phone rang one more time, and this time it was Eleanor again. "It's official," she said. "Blake's license is suspended pending investigation. They're calling it a temporary measure. You know what that means?" "It means it's over," I said. "Almost," she replied. But yes, you handled it perfectly." I looked at the empty dining table, the spot where my daughter had once plotted against me, then cried for help. "No," I said softly. It handled itself. Outside, the last streaks of daylight slipped behind the horizon. The sky turned that deep blue that comes before nightfall. Steady, unflinching, honest. The kind that tells you everything you've been waiting for has already happened. I turned off the TV, poured myself another cup of coffee and let the quiet return. It wasn't the kind of silence that hides things anymore. It was the kind that keeps them safe. The courthouse smelled like old paper and polished wood, the kind of place that carried other people's regrets in its walls. I sat quietly in the second row, hands folded in my lap, while the clerk read through the charges. Blake Dunn sat at the defendant's table, pale and deflated, his once perfect hair now dull under the fluorescent lights. Vanessa sat behind him, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. The judge was an older man, patient but sharp. "Mr. Dunn?" he said, adjusting his glasses. "You're charged with financial misrepresentation, fraudulent handling of client accounts, and attempted elder exploitation. Do you understand the charges?" Blake nodded. His voice came out low and brittle. "Yes, Your Honour." Eleanor sat beside me, a calm presence with her usual notebook, and that look of satisfaction she never quite tried to hide. She leaned over slightly. "He's going to plead out," she whispered. "His lawyer already folded. They're just negotiating the terms." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Watching Blake squirm in his tailored suit felt less like revenge and more like correction, a system finally remembering how to do its job. The prosecutor summarized the evidence, the hidden accounts, the forged authorization letters, the attempted transfer of my property. Every detail landed like a stone in water, rippling through the courtroom with quiet, methodical rhythm. When the recording played, my voice, Vanessa's, Blake's smooth persuasion, no one moved. The silence was dense, almost respectful. Blake's lawyer, a young man with the face of someone who regretted his career choice, tried to argue stress and poor judgment under personal hardship. The judge wasn't impressed. "Poor judgment doesn't explain forgery," he said flatly. Vanessa looked like she wanted to disappear into her seat. Her hands twisted together in her lap until her knuckles turned white. I could feel Eleanor glance at me once, waiting for some sign of reaction, but I stayed still. When the judge finally spoke again, his tone was final. "Mr. Dunn, you'll surrender your financial license, effective immediately. You'll also pay restitution to all affected clients and serve 1 year of probation with mandatory community service." He paused, then looked toward Vanessa. "As for Mrs. Dunn, your role in this is complicated. The state recognizes that you didn't directly commit fraud, but you were complicit in concealing it. You will perform 200 hours of community service as part of your husband's restitution agreement." Vanessa blinked rapidly, as if trying to process the words. Her lawyer whispered something, and she nodded numbly. "Court adjourned," the judge said, and the gavel came down with a crack that felt like the final punctuation of an ugly chapter. As the crowd began to move, I stood, collected my bag, and walked toward the exit. Vanessa turned, eyes glassy. "Mom," she called softly. I stopped, but didn't turn around. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice broke on the last word. "I didn't see what he was doing until it was too late." I looked over my shoulder. "That's the problem, Vanessa. You never see anything until it costs you something." Her mouth trembled, but she said nothing else. Blake didn't even look at me. His lawyer ushered him toward the hallway, head down, shoulders slumped. Outside, the air was cooler than I expected. The sky was a bright, cloudless blue that didn't care about anyone's sins. I walked with Eleanor to her car. She slipped her sunglasses on and said, "Well, that's that." "For them," I said. She gave me a sideways look. "And for you?" "For me, it's the beginning of quiet," I said. She smiled faintly. That's more dangerous than revenge. You always preferred the slow burn." "I've learned that time does better work than anger ever could," I replied. Eleanor chuckled. "Remind me to quote that someday. It'll sound brilliant in court." I stopped beside her car door. "You ever think about how predictable people become when greed runs their lives?" "All the time," she said. "They start believing other people's silence is an invitation." I nodded. "And they forget silence can also be strategy." She squeezed my arm gently. "You did good, Helen. No one could have handled this cleaner." "Clean isn't always kind," I said. "It doesn't have to be." When she drove off, I stood there for a moment, letting the late afternoon sun touch my face. The courthouse loomed behind me, its marble steps worn smooth by years of other people's mistakes. I'd been there before, once as a young lawyer, once as a witness, now as a mother whose lesson had finally been delivered. The newspaper the next morning confirmed what we already knew. Local advisor stripped of license amid financial scandal. The photo beneath it showed Blake exiting the courthouse, Vanessa just behind him, eyes downcast. But there was a smaller article tucked below it, the kind most people would have missed. Charles Whittaker Foundation expands scholarships for aerospace students. It listed the foundation's new board members, Eleanor Grant, Dean Saunders, and surprisingly, Vanessa Dunn. I'd made that decision quietly the night before court, filing the papers myself. It wasn't mercy, it was opportunity. That afternoon, I called Vanessa. She sounded wary, like someone bracing for bad news. "I saw your name in the paper," I said. "You put me on the board," she replied slowly. "Yes," I said. "You'll be working with Eleanor and Dean on community projects. That should cover your service hours and maybe teach you something about value." She was quiet for a long time. "Why?" she asked finally. "Because punishment changes behaviour," I said, "but work changes character." When the call ended, I sat back in Charles's old armchair and stared out the window. The magnolia tree was shedding its blossoms early this year, petals scattered like pale confetti on the lawn. The sight made me think of endings that weren't really endings, just pauses between better seasons. The evening news played softly in the background, but I wasn't listening. Somewhere between the faint hum of the TV and the distant sound of birds outside, I realized something simple. This was never about reclaiming power. It was about reclaiming peace. And for the first time in a long time, I felt it settling into the room like sunlight through clean glass, warm, unhurried, and earned. The first morning of the foundation's opening felt strange in the best way. The house that once carried tension now buzzed with quiet purpose. Volunteers moved through the hallways with boxes of brochures and name tags, while a few reporters waited outside near the magnolia tree, their cameras catching the sunlight filtering through its branches. The Charles Whittaker Foundation had taken shape faster than anyone expected. Dean Saunders handled the logistics, Eleanor oversaw the legal side, and I, for the first time in years, allowed my name to stand in public again. My husband's legacy had found its way back home, not as a fortune, but as something cleaner, something useful. The ceremony was modest. No big speeches, no red carpet, just a few rows of chairs, a small stage, and a table draped in white linen with a framed photograph of Charles smiling in front of our first aircraft model. Beside it sat a vase of magnolia blossoms. Vanessa's idea. She'd arrived early, hair tied back, sleeves rolled up. Not the polished woman who once strutted through charity galas, but someone smaller, quieter, real. She'd been volunteering for weeks, paperwork, phone calls, anything that needed doing. Sometimes I'd catch her standing by the old window in my study, staring at the trees like she was trying to remember the person she used to be before ambition turned her brittle. We didn't talk about the past much, we didn't need to. The work did the talking. When the guests started arriving, I stood near the door greeting each one. Dean approached with a confident grin, his navy suit as crisp as ever. "Helen," he said, "you've managed to make this feel like a celebration without it turning into a circus. That's rare." "It's not about me," I said. "It's about giving something back to people who still believe in building." Eleanor joined us, holding her clipboard like a weapon. "You say that, but you do realise every person here came because of you, right? Not because of some scholarship programme, but because they finally know who Helen Whittaker really is." I smiled lightly. "Then I suppose it's about time." From the corner of my eye, I saw Vanessa guiding a group of students toward the registration table. They were young, bright, nervous, eager, and it struck me how different she looked among them. There was humility in her posture now, a softness that had been missing for years. She caught my eye across the room, gave me a small nod, and went back to work. Eleanor leaned close. "You sure about letting her stay on the board?" "She needs the work more than I need the help," I said. "Let her rebuild herself through something that matters." "You really do take the long road to mercy, don't you? It's the only one that actually leads anywhere." When the speeches began, Dean took the stage first, talking about innovation and education, about how Charles's and my work had shaped aerospace development for decades. Then he paused and gestured toward me. "But none of it would exist without the quiet force behind it," he said. "The woman who proved that leadership doesn't always need a spotlight." The applause that followed was louder than I expected. I didn't crave it, but it was honest applause, the kind that doesn't flatter, it simply recognises. I walked to the microphone and looked out over the small crowd. "I'm not good at speeches," I began. "But I am good at remembering details. I remember the smell of aluminum and solder in our garage when Charles and I built our first prototype. I remember the late nights, the failed tests, the noise, the hope. We built something we thought would just carry planes. Turns out, it carried people's dreams too." The room was still. Even the reporters stopped shuffling. "This foundation isn't just about money," I continued. "It's about proving that integrity still matters. It's about helping people who build with purpose, not pride." I looked toward Vanessa again. "And it's about forgiveness, not the easy kind that forgets, but the hard kind that allows people to earn back their place." Her eyes glistened, and she lowered her head, pretending to adjust the papers in her hand. When I finished, the crowd rose in applause again. Dean came up to hug me, and for the first time since Charles's funeral, I felt warmth that wasn't forced. Eleanor whispered, "That's the kind of speech that makes people believe in decency again." Afterward, we mingled in the courtyard. Students shook my hand, telling me about their projects, satellite prototypes, new flight control algorithms. One girl, maybe 19, said, "Mrs. Whittaker, I didn't know women like you existed back then." I smiled. "We did. We just weren't on the brochures." She laughed, and I saw in her the same fire I'd had 40 years ago, the fire I'd buried to keep peace, to play roles, to survive in a world that preferred its women quiet. But silence wasn't a weakness. It was a choice, and sometimes it was the loudest thing in the room. The sun began to dip low, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Vanessa approached, holding 2 cups of lemonade. "You did good, Mom," she said softly. "So did you," I replied. "The flowers were your idea?" She nodded. "Magnolias felt right. Dad used to say they never bloom unless they trust the season." That sounds like something he'd say. She hesitated before adding, "I'm still learning to be better. I know it'll take time." I looked at her, really looked at her, the woman she was trying to become instead of the one she'd pretending to be. "Time isn't the issue," I said. "Effort is. And I see effort." Her lips trembled into a smile. "Thank you, Mom." We stood there quietly, watching the last light slip between the magnolia leaves. The laughter of students drifted through the air, mixing with the faint sound of glasses clinking. Eleanor passed by on her way out and said, "Don't go humble on me now, Helen. You just turned a family scandal into a legacy." I chuckled. "No, Eleanor. I just cleaned up after one." She winked and left. Vanessa and I stayed a little longer, neither of us in a hurry to break the peace that had finally found its way back into the house. The scent of magnolias carried through the courtyard, soft and steady. It didn't feel like a new beginning or an ending, just balance, restored in quiet, deliberate rhythm. The sound of the front gate creaking open was what caught my attention first. I was in the garden, pruning the magnolia branches, the same way Charles used to when he wanted to think. The air smelled of damp soil and lemon balm. When I turned around, Vanessa was standing at the edge of the walkway, holding a paper bag and looking unsure if she should come closer. "I brought lunch," she said, her voice tentative. "Chicken salad from that cafe you like." I brushed off my gloves and smiled faintly. "That's a peace offering if I ever saw one." She exhaled, almost laughing. "Maybe. Can I come in?" "Of course," I said, moving aside. "You don't need an invitation to your own mother's house." Inside, the house was quieter than usual. I'd gotten used to the stillness these past months. It wasn't lonely. It was steady. Vanessa set the bag down on the counter and began unpacking containers like she was afraid of breaking something invisible. "I've been working at the foundation every day," she said, not looking up. "Eleanor says I'm actually helpful." "I've heard," I said. "Dean told me you've been organising the mentorship programme." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Yeah, it feels good doing something real, something that isn't about appearances." "That's the trick, isn't it?" I said. "Doing the right thing when no one's watching." She paused, then looked at me. "I didn't think you'd ever forgive me." "I didn't say I have," I replied gently. "Forgiveness isn't an event, it's a process. It takes work on both sides." She nodded slowly. "I know, I'm just trying." We sat at the table, the same one where she and Blake once tried to convince me to sell my home. Now the irony felt almost poetic. She passed me a container, and for a while, the only sound was the clink of silverware against plates. Halfway through lunch, she spoke again. "I keep replaying everything in my head. The way I let him talk about you. The way I didn't stop him. I thought I was protecting my marriage." "You were protecting your comfort," I said softly. "And comfort is often the first thing we sacrifice when it's time to grow." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't look away this time. "I lost everything I thought I needed, and it turns out none of it mattered." "That's because you finally learned what does," I said. "Character survives when status doesn't." She wiped her cheeks and managed a shaky laugh. "You always have a quote ready, don't you?" "I've had 70 years to collect them," I said, smiling. "They're cheaper than therapy." For the first time in a long while, she laughed genuinely. It wasn't the nervous, high-pitched laugh she used to hide behind. It was softer, freer. After we cleaned up, she asked if she could see the magnolia garden again. We walked outside together. The trees were fuller now, heavy with late blooms. She bent down, touching one of the blossoms. "I used to think these flowers looked fragile," she said, "but they hold up through every storm." "Strong roots," I said. "They bend before they break." She turned to me. "Like you." I chuckled. "I've been called worse." We stood there in comfortable silence. A breeze moved through the branches, scattering petals over the grass. Vanessa watched them fall. "You know, I didn't come today just to talk," she said. "There's something else." I raised an eyebrow. "Should I be nervous?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded envelope. "It's from Blake. He sent it to my apartment last week." I hesitated before taking it. The handwriting was unmistakable, neat, deliberate, proud. I opened it and read in silence. It wasn't an apology so much as a confession, the debts, the arrogance, the regret that came too late. He wrote about prison being quieter than he expected, about having too much time to think, and at the end, a single line, "Tell your mother she was right about everything, especially about me." I folded the letter neatly and set it aside. That man always did love his dramatic endings. Vanessa sighed. He says he's being transferred to a work program next month. He wants to write to me again. I don't know if I should respond. That's up to you, I said. But ask yourself this, do you owe him comfort or closure? She looked down, thinking, probably closure. Then write once, I said. Say what you need to say and let the rest stay buried, she nodded. I think I can do that. We sat on the garden bench afterward, sunlight flickering through the leaves. For once, she didn't look restless or defensive. She just looked at peace. I was at the foundation yesterday, she said. One of the scholarship students, his mother came to thank me. She said her son wants to design aircraft engines someday. I told her about Dad, about what you and he built. I smiled faintly. That's a story worth telling. She said something I can't stop thinking about, Vanessa continued. She said, when someone gives you a chance, don't waste it trying to prove you deserve it. Just do the work. That woman's wise, I said. Maybe she should be running the foundation. Vanessa laughed. Maybe she already is in spirit. The light was fading now, painting everything gold. She turned toward me again. Mom, I'm sorry it took losing everything to see you clearly. You're not just my mother. You're the woman I wish I'd been brave enough to be. I reached over and took her hand. Then start now. Her fingers tightened around mine, and in that moment I saw the girl she'd been, the one who used to chase lightning bugs with her father, who believed the world could be kind if you were. That part of her had never truly vanished. It had just been buried under too much pride. The air grew cooler as the sun dropped lower, and for the first time in years, the silence between us felt full instead of empty. She leaned her head on my shoulder like she used to when she was a child. Mom, she said quietly. Yes. Thank you for not giving up on me. I never did, I said. I just waited until you were ready to find yourself again. The magnolias rustled softly above us, their white petals drifting down like a quiet kind of blessing, falling into her hair as the day folded itself neatly into evening. The morning light filtered through the magnolia branches, scattering soft patterns across my desk. The house smelled faintly of coffee and paper, the same way it did in the years Charles and I used to work late over blueprints and designs. The difference now was the quiet. Not the heavy kind that comes from grief, but the peaceful sort that follows understanding. I was finishing a letter, the final piece of paperwork for the Foundation's annual review. The Charles Whittaker Foundation for Civil Innovation and Education had officially funded 12 scholarships this year. 12 young engineers who'd come from nowhere and built something out of persistence alone. Dean had handled the press releases. Eleanor had secured a grant from a national program. Vanessa had overseen every scholarship interview herself. When I thought about that, I couldn't help but smile. The woman who once measured worth in wealth was now mentoring students who couldn't even afford textbooks. I'd watched her transform quietly without fanfare or excuses. Forgiveness hadn't made her smaller, it had made her steady. Outside, I heard the gate open. It was Saturday morning, and I knew that sound by heart now. Vanessa arrived with coffee every weekend, usually dragging along one of the scholarship students who needed advice or inspiration, or just a home-cooked meal. This time, she came alone. Morning, Mom, she said, stepping into the kitchen with 2 steaming cups. I stopped by Franklin's Cafe. They had your favourite roast. That place charges too much for coffee, I said, taking the cup anyway. You used to say the same thing about charity, she teased, smiling. We sat by the window, the same spot where she'd once confessed everything. Only now the weight was gone. She looked younger somehow, not in years, but in spirit. How's the Foundation's mentorship program coming? I asked. She grinned. Busy. We've got 2 of the students interning at AeroCorps this summer. Can you believe it? The same company that once told you women didn't belong in aeronautics. I can believe it, I said. Progress has a long memory. It just takes time to catch up. She laughed softly, stirring her coffee. You sound like Eleanor. God forbid, I replied. She still thinks sarcasm is a form of therapy. We both laughed, the kind of easy laughter that only happens after too many years of the opposite. On the dining table, Vanessa had laid out a small folder. These are the letters from the new scholarship recipients, she said. I thought you might like to read them. I opened the first one. It was written in blue ink, the handwriting awkward but full of heart. Dear Mrs. Whittaker, I don't know if I deserve this, but I'll spend the rest of my life making sure I earn it. My mother says opportunity is just another word for trust. Thank you for trusting me. The others were similar, grateful, hopeful, human. I read each one carefully, letting their words wash over me. Somewhere between the second and third letter, I realised my hands had stopped shaking when I held a pen. When I looked up, Vanessa was watching me quietly. You did it, Mom, she said. You built something that lasts. So did you, I said. You rebuilt yourself. She swallowed hard, blinking back emotion. I couldn't have without you. I shook my head. You could have. You just needed to remember who raised you. The wind outside picked up, carrying magnolia petals against the glass. For a brief moment, it looked like snow, a southern kind of miracle. Vanessa leaned back in her chair. You know, I've been thinking about writing a book about Dad. About both of you, really. What you built, the obstacles you faced, the legacy you left behind. You'd make your father proud, I said. Just promise me you won't make it sound like a tragedy. He'd hate that. I won't, she said. It's not a tragedy anymore. Her words hung in the air, and I realised she was right. It wasn't. It was a story that had found its symmetry, the rise, the fall, and the quiet rebuilding that came after. Later that afternoon, we took a drive out to the Foundation's new community centre. The sign above the entrance gleamed in the sun, Whittaker Learning Hub. Inside, students worked on small aircraft models, 3D printers buzzing in the background. The place smelled of fresh paint and potential. A young girl approached us shyly. Mrs. Whittaker? Mrs. Dunn? We just wanted to say thank you. Vanessa smiled. For what? For believing in us, the girl said. Most people don't. I looked at her and saw a reflection of every student Charles and I had mentored decades ago. Hungry, brilliant, stubborn enough to change the world. You don't need people to believe in you, I said gently. You just need one person to remind you that you can. Her eyes lit up, and she nodded before running back to her group. Vanessa turned to me. You realise that's going on the wall, right? If it ends up next to the fire extinguisher, I'm fine with that, I said. We stayed there for hours, watching the students work, their laughter echoing down the hallways. It felt like the sound of a promise kept. When we drove home, the sun dipped low behind the city skyline, painting everything in amber light. Vanessa hummed along to a song on the radio, one of those slow southern ballads Charles used to love. For once it didn't make me sad. It just felt like completion. Back at the house, I walked into my office and sat at the desk one last time for the evening. The room was full of old photographs, Charles in his workshop, our first plane model, a younger me holding Vanessa as a baby. On the wall hung the Foundation's charter, framed neatly beside a small brass plaque that read, Integrity builds what ambition destroys. I ran my hand over the frame and whispered, We did it, Charles. We made it mean something. Outside, the magnolias swayed under the setting sun, their white petals catching the last of the light. For a moment, the whole world felt still, balanced, quiet, and true. And as the day slipped into dusk, I thought of the line I'd written for the Foundation's website, the one that had come to me late one night when sleep refused to. Revenge isn't anger. It's peace, when truth finally speaks for itself. I didn't know if people would understand it the way I did, but that didn't matter. The meaning wasn't in the words. It was in the life that followed them. And in that quiet, I realised something simple and final. I hadn't won against anyone. I'd simply stopped losing myself. The house was quiet again that evening, just the hum of the ceiling fan and the soft rustle of magnolia leaves outside. I sat on the porch with my coffee, watching the sky turn gold, then blue, then that deep shade of peace that only comes after everything's been said and done. It struck me how strange revenge can look when it's born from love instead of hate. Some people think revenge stories are about payback, about making someone suffer the way they made you suffer. But in real life, especially in family revenge stories, the justice that matters most isn't about destruction. It's about restoration. It's about showing that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. When you've lived long enough, you realize that peace itself is the most satisfying form of revenge, because peace means you won't let pain define the rest of your life. I looked at the magnolia tree and thought of Charles, of Vanessa, of everything we had built and nearly lost. And in that stillness, I finally understood what he meant all those years ago when he said, "Some storms don't destroy. They just wash the dirt away." The air smelled clean again. The story had ended exactly the way it was meant to. Not with anger, but with balance. If you enjoy stories like this, family drama that turns pain into strength, and revenge stories where wisdom wins instead of cruelty, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. There's always another truth waiting to be told.